She was never supposed to be seen. That was the whole point. Show up, clean the floors, disappear. Nobody looks at the janitor. Nobody ever does. And for 2 years, Aria Hunter had built her entire survival on that one ugly truth. But tonight, everything she had carefully, quietly built, her invisibility, her safety, her silence, was about to walk straight off a cliff. And the only thing standing between a man's destruction and the worst mistake of his life was her mop, her peripheral vision, and 4 words she had absolutely no business saying. The 42nd floor of Choi Tower was not a place meant for people like her. She knew that. She had always known that. The marble beneath her mop was Italian, the kind so white and cold it looked like it had never been touched by anything as ordinary as a human foot. The chandelier above her threw fractured light across everything, the kind of light that made even shadows look expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows swallowed the entire southern wall, and beyond the glass, Seoul glittered 42 floors below, the Han River a dark ribbon of silver, the lights of Gangnam burning like something that had never once considered going out. Aria moved the mop in long, slow arcs and did not look up. She had learned, very early, that looking up in rooms like this one cost you something. So she kept her eyes on the floor and her ears wide open, and she catalogued. The way her diplomat father had taught her, the way you catalog everything when the world around you is never quite as stable as it pretends to be. She noted the engraved nameplates at each chair along the mahogany table. The confidential folders sitting carelessly on the credenza, their edges slightly misaligned. The security panel she had memorized over 14 months of being no one. The air, cedarwood, aged whiskey, and something colder underneath. Something metallic. The particular smell of a room where decisions get made that break people's lives, and nobody loses sleep over it. The other janitors had left an hour ago. Aria always finished last. She was meticulous. It was the one indulgence she allowed herself in this life, doing the invisible work with an invisible kind of excellence. She was rinsing the mop head when the elevator opened. She did not look up. She heard him before she saw him, not because he was loud, but because the room changed when he entered. The air tightened. The expensive silence of the suite became a different kind of silence entirely, the kind that knows better than to make noise in the presence of something it cannot afford to disturb. She looked up. Choi Ji-hun was younger than the legends about him suggested. 32 at most, though he carried himself with the particular weight of a man who had been making irreversible decisions since he was far too young to understand what irreversible meant. The charcoal suit was immaculate. The kind of precise that reads less like vanity and more like armor, like a man who had decided long ago that the world would find no gap in him to exploit. The tattoos climbing his neck were deliberate art, each one chosen, each one permanent, a map of loyalties written in ink directly onto his skin. His face was all hard angles and controlled stillness. But his eyes were dark and liquid and fractured with a kind of intelligence that moved too fast for his face to fully contain. The eyes of a man who was always thinking 3 conversations ahead of the one he was having. He did not notice her. Of course he did not notice her. She was the janitor. Behind him came 4 men in suits, and then Director Shin. A man whose face Aria knew the way she knew the floor plan of every executive suite in this building. By repetition, by observation, by the particular attention she paid to things other people were trained not to see. Shin was in his 60s, silver-haired, warm-voiced, the kind of man whose entire professional life had been constructed around the art of seeming trustworthy. Behind him, a young woman in a blazer carrying a leather-bound document thick enough to anchor something. Aria kept mopping. The conversation that followed was in Korean, smooth, formal, the kind of corporate language that sanded the edges off everything it described. Aria understood every word. She understood 6 languages and had chosen to deploy exactly none of them in this building, because the second you stopped being unremarkable was the second you stopped being safe. Director Shin called it a strategic merger. A partnership. A document that would secure the Jeju coastal assets and protect the Choi legacy for the generation that came after. His voice was warm, practiced in the specific way of a man who has rehearsed an answer so many times it no longer feels like a lie, it just feels like Tuesday. Ji-hun asked 3 questions. Precise, quiet, surgical. Shin answered each one with the fluid ease of a man who had anticipated every angle. A fountain pen appeared, gold-tipped, heavy. Ji-hun picked it up. Aria was near the credenza, moving the mop in slow arcs, her eyes on the floor, until they weren't. She had always had extraordinary peripheral vision. It was another thing she had never advertised. The bold header of Clause 74 was clearly visible from where she stood. Territorial concession, White Tiger Syndicate, unconditional and irrevocable. She read it once. Then again. Director Shin had called it a merger with Haesong Development. What was printed on that page was not a merger. It was a surrender. A document that would hand Ji Hun's rivals every single thing he had ever built, signed in his own hand, witnessed and binding and permanent. Arya's mop stopped moving. Her heart stopped with it. She was 21 years old. She was a janitor. She was the daughter of a diplomat currently posted in Brussels, a graduate student at Yonsei on a scholarship she needed to keep. A woman who had spent 14 months perfecting the art of being no one in this building specifically because being no one was the only thing keeping her whole. The pen hovered above the signature line. The rational part of her brain, the careful, structured, survival-oriented part that her father had spent years cultivating, it was already mapping the exit. Service door, elevator, basement, gone. Whatever happened in this room was not her business, was not her problem, was not her life to interrupt or redirect or save. Her feet did not move toward the exit. They moved toward the table. Something old and stubborn was moving them. Her mother's conviction, maybe, that you do not watch a person walk into a trap and say nothing. Her father's bone-deep belief that there are moments in a life when silence is not neutrality. It is just a slower kind of wrong. She leaned down near Ji Hun's chair, ostensibly retrieving a napkin from the floor. A motion so practiced and invisible it barely registered as human movement. She brought her mouth close to the only ear that mattered. Her voice was barely a vibration. Barely breath. Don't sign it. It's not what they're telling you. She straightened. She picked up her mop. She walked, slowly, steadily, the walk of a woman who had done nothing unusual, toward the service exit. She did not look back. She pushed through the door and pressed her back against the wall of the corridor beyond, her entire body vibrating with what she had just done. The air in the back corridor was cold and industrial and smelled like cleaning fluid and concrete and the particular emptiness of spaces that exist only to be passed through. She stood there and breathed. Then she heard it, the sharp, decisive click of a pen cap being replaced. No scratch of ink against paper. No signature. Just the sound of a pen put down. The sound of something unsigned is the loudest thing Arya Hunter has ever heard in her life. And somewhere beneath the relief, in the part of her that was already understanding what came next, there was the quiet, terrible knowledge that she had just made herself visible. And there was no taking that back. Before we dive in, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop your location in the comments. Our community keeps growing every single week, and I love seeing where you're all watching from. Every like, every comment, every share helps us keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, let's get into it. She told herself it was over before the service elevator reached the basement. That was the deal she made with herself, the only deal available. She had spoken. He had not signed. The universe had absorbed the moment and moved on, the way it always did, indifferent to the small acts of recklessness that happened in its margins. She was nobody. She had done nothing. She would go home, sleep 4 hours, and return tomorrow to clean floors that didn't know her name. The basement smelled like industrial cleaner and fluorescent light, the particular ugliness of spaces that exist beneath beautiful things. Arya changed out of her uniform in the locker room, her fingers steady on the buttons, her mind running the numbers the way her father had taught her. Assets. She had not been noticed. Liabilities. 17 security cameras had her on footage within 3 feet of Choi Ji-hun at the moment of decision. Probability of consequence. She had been telling herself low. She was no longer certain that was honest. She was 21 years old and she had spent her whole life learning to read rooms. What she had just read, leaning over that mahogany table, was not a merger document. It was an execution order with a fountain pen. And the part of her that her mother had grown, the part that did not sit down when wrong things happened in front of it, had refused to let her feet find the exit. She walked to the subway. Seoul at midnight wore itself differently than Seoul at noon. Quieter but not quieter in a peaceful way, quieter in the way of a held breath. The city exhaling neon and humidity and the low hum of 10 million lives running parallel and never quite touching. She counted stops. She thought about her paper on social stratification that was due in 11 days. She thought about her father in Brussels, who would be asleep now, who had no idea that his daughter had just whispered a warning to the most dangerous man in South Korea and walked away carrying the recklessness of it in her chest like a second heartbeat. Her apartment in Mappo was small and exact, every object in it chosen for function, the walls bare except for the corkboard above her desk that held her research notes and a single photograph of her mother, laughing at something outside the frame. Arya had always loved that photograph because it captured a happiness she hadn't been the cause of and couldn't take credit for. Her mother had been a whole person before she was anyone's mother. It mattered to remember that. She unlocked the door. She pushed it open. She reached for the light switch. The lights were already on. She did not scream. The instinct for it rose and she pressed it down with both hands the way you press down on a wound. Fast, automatic, necessary. A man sat at her kitchen table. He was in his 40s, Korean, dressed in a suit so dark it absorbed the light around it, and he held himself with the particular stillness of someone who had never once in his professional life needed to raise his voice to be understood. On the table in front of him, arranged with geometric precision, were three things: her university ID, her student records, a photograph of her father's embassy in Brussels. Mr. Choi, the man said, would like a conversation. She looked at the photograph of the embassy. She looked at the three items on the table and understood their arrangement was not incidental. Each one was a coordinate. Together they formed a map of everywhere she had left herself exposed without knowing she was being watched. She asked for 10 minutes to change her shoes. The man said yes, politely. The politeness was the most terrifying part. The black sedan that collected her smelled of leather and climate-controlled silence. The city moved past the tinted windows, the Han River, the bridges, the receding lights of a district where she had lived for 14 months pretending to be no one, and apparently failing at it with extraordinary completeness. She sat in the back and thought with the structured calm of a woman who had learned, very young, that panic was a luxury for people with more options than she currently had. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she had seen. She thought about the specific look on Director Shin's face during that presentation. The rehearsed warmth of it, the way his answers came too smoothly for questions that should have required a beat of genuine reflection. She thought about what kind of man would orchestrate a betrayal of that scale, and what kind of leverage would be required to move a man in Shin's position toward something so catastrophic and so irreversible. She was still thinking when the car stopped. She looked up at a building that scraped the bottom of the clouds and understood that whatever came next, she was no longer a woman with the luxury of anonymity. The ghost had been seen. And Seoul, she had always known, did not allow ghosts the mercy of disappearing twice. The penthouse was a kind of violence dressed as beauty. Arya understood this within the first hour. The bedroom they showed her to had floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the entire city into a painting she was not allowed to leave. The closet held clothes in her size, not approximations, not close guesses, but her precise measurements, which meant someone had looked at her closely and for longer than she had known. The kitchen held ingredients she recognized from the meals she cooked in her Mappo apartment, brands she bought from the same market every Thursday morning. The library was stocked in 4 languages, one of them English, one of them Korean, one of them French. Which was the language her mother had spoken when she was being her most honest? The detail of it was a message. You have been seen. You have always been seen. The invisibility was something we permitted, and we can withdraw it whenever we choose. She did not pace. She did not cry. She sat at the kitchen counter and ate the breakfast she made herself from the stranger's groceries, and she thought. Choi Ji-hun moved through his own space like a man perpetually passing through, never settled, never entirely present, always wearing the particular expression of someone running calculations behind their stillness. He left before dawn and returned after midnight, and in between those hours the penthouse was occupied only by the silent men in the corridor, the city 42 floors below, and Arya. She watched him the way she had always watched the men in that building, not with malice, not with sentiment, but with the particular attention of a woman who had learned that what people reveal when they think they are alone is the most honest data available. She saw the tie come loose the moment he cleared the doorway. Saw the whiskey poured and set aside untouched. Saw the weight in his shoulders, not the performance of power, but the actual burden of it, the second skeleton he carried everywhere he went. Once, at 2 a.m, she came out of the library for water and found him standing at the window with both hands pressed flat against the glass, looking at the city below with an expression she was not prepared for. It was not anger. It was not grief precisely. It was the expression of a man who had built something enormous and was beginning to understand the cost of keeping it. He was gone by the time she reached the kitchen. She had not been certain he knew she was there. She was wrong. On day 4, she stopped trying to read the novels in the library and started doing the only thing that had ever actually calmed her. She reconstructed. She pulled the legal pad from the desk drawer and began writing from memory, working backward through 14 months of observation in Choi Tower. The pattern of late meetings. The particular anxiety of certain assistants. The confidential documents she had never been meant to notice. The calendar shifts. The security consultations that happened quietly in the executive corridor on the 38th floor, 3 weeks before the contract appeared. When Jae-hun came home that evening, earlier than usual, which she noted, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She did not look up from the legal pad. "You should sit down," she said. "This is going to take a while." What she laid out was not intuition. It was architecture. The careful construction of a timeline built from fragments no single person should have been able to assemble because no single person had ever been meant to have access to all of them simultaneously. Except for the woman who cleaned every floor of the building and whom no one had ever once bothered to be careful around. The gas leak at his preferred restaurant, which his security team had used to justify a full restructuring of his protection agreement. She had been cleaning the 29th floor 2 days before the incident and overheard a conversation she had filed without knowing why. Shin's assistant had been in that corridor. Shin had not. The assistant had been on his phone, speaking very quietly in a register that did not match a man relaying his employer's instructions. It matched a man relaying instructions to his employer. Jae-hun stood at the end of her presentation without moving for long enough that she thought she had miscalculated. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "How much of this," he said carefully, "do you actually know? And how much are you building from inference?" She drew a line across the legal pad. "Everything above that line is observation. Everything below is logic." He looked at the line. He looked at her. "The gap between those two things," he said, "is smaller than it should be." "Yes," she said. He was quiet. She watched him think. Saw the precise machinery of it working behind his eyes, organizing, discarding, retaining. When he reached out and pulled the legal pad toward him, she felt something shift in the room. Not warmth. He did not deal in warmth the way other people did. But presence. He was present with her in a way he had not been before, and it weighted the air between them differently, made the distance between their chairs feel like a deliberate measurement rather than an accident. He brought her coffee before she asked for it the following morning. He set it on the counter without comment and was halfway to the elevator before she registered the cup. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she wrapped both hands around it and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had survived by reading rooms correctly, that the shape of her captivity had just changed in a way that neither of them had named yet. The briefing room smelled like tension and recycled air. Arya sat at the far end of the table. The end nobody pulled a chair out for. The end she claimed for herself without asking. And watched men who were trained to show nothing work very hard at showing nothing. Jae-hun's inner circle was 6 people deep, and every one of them had spent the last 20 minutes pretending she was not in the room. She catalogued each of them without meeting their eyes. 2 were genuinely loyal. She could tell by the way their attention tracked Jae-hun rather than each other. 2 were calculating. 1 was afraid. 1 was performing calm with the brittle precision of a man who had been rehearsing it since morning. She did not interrupt the briefing. She listened. The evidence against Director Shin was incomplete, significant enough to raise an alarm, not sufficient to act on without fracturing the board along fault lines that would benefit the enemy more than any surrender document could. The men at the table debated strategy with the language of chess players, controlled, positional, patient. Arya thought about none of that. She thought about a woman named Park Ji-soo. Ji-soo had worked for Director Shin for 9 years. She was 34 years old, efficient, forgettable in the precise way that administrative staff were groomed to be. Arya had seen her in the executive corridor dozens of times, always 2 steps behind Shin, always carrying his schedule, always wearing the same expression of careful professional neutrality. Except today, during the briefing, when Shin's name appeared on the slide, twice, Jisoo's right hand had moved to her own wrist. A small, automatic press. The kind of pressure a person applies to themselves when something needs to be suppressed before it surfaces. She was not loyal to him. She was afraid of him. There was a precise and important difference between those two things, and it was the difference between a closed door and a door that had been locked from the outside by someone else. When the briefing ended and the room cleared, Arya stayed. Ji-hun moved to the window. She gave him 30 seconds of silence, which was the amount he seemed to need before he could receive anything. His assistant, she said. Ji-soo. She knows more than she's filed anywhere. He turned. The look he gave her was evaluative rather than dismissive. She had earned that much over the past 4 days. She told him what she had seen. The wrist. The timing. The specific body language of a person containing a reaction rather than not having one. She told him that 9 years of proximity to a man like Shin meant Ji-soo held architecture, the pattern of his decisions, the rhythm of his habits, the texture of his fear. She would not give it willingly to anyone who came at her with power. But she would give it to someone who offered her a door. Ji-soo, when approached by one of Ji-hun's people through a channel that carried no threat and no coercion, opened the door in under an hour. What came through it was precise and catastrophic. Payment records, encrypted but recoverable, linking Shin to a shell company whose beneficial ownership traced back to the White Tiger Syndicate's financial infrastructure. Ji-soo had photographed the statements herself, 2 years ago, the night she understood what she had accidentally witnessed and realized she had no one left to tell. She had been carrying the photographs on a memory card in the lining of her work bag every day since. Waiting for a door. The data confirmed what Arya's legal pad had outlined. But the data also went further. It named names. It drew connections. And in its architecture, it revealed something Arya had not anticipated. Something that stopped her mid-sentence when she read it. Shin had a son. The file contained a death certificate. 20 years old. A car accident. 11 years ago. After the accident, Shin's remaining family, a daughter, a son-in-law, 2 grandchildren, had accumulated debts of a scale that no board member's salary, however significant, could absorb quietly. The syndicate had absorbed them instead. Quietly, precisely, with the practiced patience of people who understood that the most reliable leverage was not a threat, it was a IFT left long enough to become a chain. Shin had not betrayed Ji-hun for money or ambition or ideology. He had done it because the people he loved most in the world were collateral that had been held so gently and for so long that the hand holding them no longer felt like a fist. Arya sat with that for a long time. When Ji-hun emerged from reading the files alone, the files she had helped locate, the files that drew the full shape of his oldest ally's betrayal, he stood at the window with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not the cold calculation of a man deciding what to do. It was the expression of a man realizing that something he had believed to be solid was, in fact, a performance that the other person had hated giving. He was at my father's funeral, Ji-hun said. His voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume control. Arya looked at his profile against the glass, the sharp jaw, the ink climbing his neck, the specific stillness of a man holding himself together through the force of habit rather than the absence of feeling. He made a wrong choice, she said, for a real reason. One doesn't cancel the other. He turned. His eyes found hers across the room. In them, she saw something she had not seen there before. Not gratitude, not warmth exactly, but the specific recognition of one person seeing another person clearly. The kind of look that costs something to give and something to receive. I need to move, he said finally. Before they realize we know. She nodded. She was already thinking about what came next. She had stopped noticing, somewhere in the last 4 days, that she was thinking of it as we. The dress was black silk, not soft, not flowing, but architectural. It had structure in the bodice and fell clean to the floor, and it had clearly been chosen by someone who understood that armor came in different forms. Arya stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself with the evaluative eye she normally reserved for rooms rather than reflections. Her hair was out, full and natural, the coils defined and falling heavy around her face and past her shoulders, an aesthetic decision she had made herself, deliberately, because she was not performing anyone's version of appropriate tonight. The diamond earrings caught light in a way that was almost aggressive. She left them on. The estate sat outside the city in the kind of quiet that wealth purchases and guards jealously, traditional architecture, curved tiled roofs against a navy sky going dark at the edges, a garden of manicured stones and paper lanterns strung between cherry trees. The air smelled like autumn and cedar and something ceremonial, beautiful in the specific way of things that have never needed to be anything else. Arya walked in at Ji-hun's right hand and felt the room recalibrate in real time. 8 men around a long lacquered table, 8 men who ran pieces of an empire and had spent years positioning themselves within it, and every single one of them recalculating the moment she took her seat. She was not a face they recognized. She was not a category they had prepared for. She was at his right hand, which was not a seat given to assistants or consultants. It was a seat given to people the man at the head of the table had decided to declare. Director Shin sat at the far end. His composure was extraordinary, silver-haired, warm-eyed, the practiced authority of a man who had spent decades being the most trustworthy person in the room. When his gaze found her, it stayed for half a beat longer than calculation. In that half beat, she saw it, a variable he had not planned for. A thread he could not immediately identify. She held his gaze long enough to let him know she had seen his seeing, then looked away first, because she could afford to. The dinner moved with the formal choreography of an exercise in mutual surveillance disguised as hospitality. The food arrived in silence, served by staff so trained in disappearance they might as well have been smoke. Ji-hun spoke rarely and with the specific economy of a man who understood that in a room like this, every word was a chess piece. When he laughed at something a board member said, a single, brief sound, Shin's response came half a second late. Arya noted it. She noted the way the man to her left glanced at her with a question he was too practiced to ask aloud. She noted the way Ji-hun's shoulder turned a fraction of a degree toward her when he spoke to the man on his other side, the smallest possible declaration, and entirely deliberate. He leaned toward her once, to refill her water glass himself rather than wait for staff. His face was close enough that she could see the precise line where the tattoo at his neck ended, the ink deliberate and fine against the angle of his jaw. He smelled like cedarwood and something colder underneath. He did not look at her when he spoke. He spoke toward the table, as if commenting on the evening, but the words were for her alone. Shin has been watching you since you sat down. I know, she said quietly, without turning her head. Good, he said, and straightened. The errand came at the end of the evening, a document, he said, in the car. He needed it before the board dispersed. Would she mind? His voice was even and his eyes were careful, and she understood in the same moment he asked it that this was not an errand. It was a test, not of her, of them. Of what Shin's people would do when she was separated from the table. The gravel drive was long and lantern-lit, the garden pressing dark on either side, the estate house blazing warm behind her as she walked away from it. Her heels found the stones with precision. The night air was cold against the silk at her shoulders. She was thinking about the document, what it would be, whether it was real, when she heard it. The engine, no headlights, pure acceleration, coming from the curve in the drive where the lanterns did not reach. She had time to process it. She did not have time to move. The high beams came on like detonation, white, blinding, aimed. She threw herself sideways and something hit her first. An arm, steel fast and certain, wrenching her off the path and into the shadow of the stone wall at the garden's edge. The car screamed past on the gravel, close enough that the displaced air moved the hem of her dress. Then tail lights, then dark, then silence. They were pressed against the wall, her back to the stone, her face against the lapel of his charcoal jacket, his arms still locked around her. She could feel his chest expanding and contracting, could feel the warmth of him through the fabric, and beneath that, his heartbeat. Fast, furious, shockingly human for a man who had always seemed to her like something assembled rather than born. She did not move immediately. Neither did he. The garden smelled like chrysanthemums and cold stone and the particular sharpness of near miss, and the arm around her was not loosening, and she was acutely aware of every point of contact between his body and hers. The solidity of him, the heat, the tension in his hold that was no longer just emergency and not yet anything he had named. Her dress had twisted at the waist. One of her earrings had caught in his collar. She reached to free it, her fingers grazing the line of his jaw, and the sound he did not make was louder than anything he could have said. When he spoke, his voice was stripped down to something raw. Are you hurt? Not a question, a demand. Quiet and low and urgent in a register she had not heard from him before. She shook her head. Her hand was still near his jaw. She lowered it. Neither of them stepped back immediately. The wall was cold through her dress and his arm was warm, and the space they occupied together in the shadow of the garden wall was the size of a decision neither of them was ready to make out loud. She stepped back first. He let her. His arm fell away with a deliberateness that was its own kind of answer. They walked back to the house in silence. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. The lanterns threw gold circles on the path. The silence between them was entirely new. Not the silence of strangers, not the silence of a man and his captive, but something that had no name yet and was deciding, moment by moment, whether it needed one. The penthouse felt different at 2 in the morning after someone had tried to kill you. Arya made tea. It was the thing her hands knew how to do when the world became too large for thinking. Fill the kettle, set it, stand at the counter and let the sound of water heating be the only thing required of her. She made 2 cups without deciding to. Set one at the edge of the counter where Ji-hun was moving through the room, giving orders in measured sentences, deploying his security team to trace the plates and pull the footage and identify the driver. His voice was level, his face was composed. And his shoulder, she noticed, was carrying the particular tension of a man who was working very hard at not looking at her. He stopped when he saw the second cup. She watched him register it. Watched him pick it up. Watched him sit down across from her at the kitchen counter. Without an agenda, without a crisis to anchor the interaction, without the structured purpose that had organized every conversation they had ever had. He sat down because there was a cup of tea at his elbow and the woman who made it was sitting there. And for once neither of them had a role to perform. He talked, haltingly at first, in the way of a man whose native language was action rather than disclosure. He talked about his father, not the legend of him, not the public myth, but the actual man, who had built the empire from a fish market stall in Busan with his hands and his fury and a particular understanding of how power actually moved through the world. Who had told him, once, when he was 14 and furious about something small, that the people who come for you are rarely the ones you should be watching. It's the ones who love you and run out of options. His father had looked at him with a steadiness that had felt, at the time, like instruction rather than warning. He understood now that it was both. Shin was the one who told me it was mine to keep or lose, Ji-hun said. The night after my father's burial. He sat with me for 4 hours and he said, "Your father built something that deserves to survive. Don't let grief make you small enough to lose it." He set his tea down. Looked at it. He said that Arya did not offer comfort. She had never found comfort useful in moments that deserved something more honest. He may have meant it, she said, when he said it. Ji-hun looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Not the mask, not the calculation, but the man underneath both of those things, briefly visible. That, he said quietly, is worse. She told him something true in return. Not because strategy required it, but because his honesty in this moment had a weight that demanded to be met with equal weight. She told him about her father, not the ambassador, but the man who had been betrayed twice in his career by colleagues he had trusted with things that cost him. She told him what it had looked like from the outside, watching a man absorb a betrayal and choose, very quietly, to keep working. She had grown up inside that quiet. She had grown up understanding that there were moments when speaking was not interference. It was the only honest available option. I have always had a problem, she said, with watching wrong things happen and staying in my seat. Something shifted in the air. He was looking at her with an attention she could feel like a change in pressure. Has it ever made anything easier? Not once, she said. The sound he made was brief and low. Not quite a laugh, not quite something else. It landed in her chest in a way she did not examine immediately. She turned back to the counter and opened her laptop. The secondary server Jisoo had referenced required a specific logic. She explained it while she worked. The particular way a man like Shin would have organized his private communication channels based on behavioral patterns she had observed over 14 months of cleaning above him. Ji-hun stood beside her and watched her work, and the proximity of him, the cedarwood and cold warmth of his presence, was a thing she was aware of without acknowledging it, the way you are aware of weather. The server opened. What came out of it reordered the room. The full plan, the complete, documented architecture of it, was there. The months of manufactured pressure. The staged vulnerabilities. The contract designed as a surrender concealed as a partnership. And the final piece, the piece she had not found before. A sequence of communications that outlined what was meant to happen at the moment of signing. His death. Staged. Attributed. The empire transferred to Shin as acting regent, with syndicate interests embedded in the transfer structure. Everything Ji-hun had built handed to the people who had been circling it for 3 years, through the hands of the man who had sat with him through his grief and told him it was his to keep. The room was very quiet. Arya became aware, slowly, that she had been holding her breath. She released it carefully and looked at her hands on the keyboard. They were steady. They had always been steady in crisis. It was the quiet afterward that cost her. She felt him turn toward her. She looked up. His expression was unguarded in a way that was almost too much to look at directly, not broken, not undone, but opened, in the way a room is opened after something sealed inside it for a very long time has finally been released. He looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in the room. "Who are you?" he said. Not suspiciously. The question was specific and sincere. She met his eyes. The distance between them at the counter was small enough that she could see the precise line of the tattoo at his collar, could see the way his jaw was working to hold the expression steady. "Someone," she said quietly, "who made a choice she can't unmake. Same as you." He was still looking at her when she turned back to the screen. She could feel him there, the warmth and the weight of him, for a long time after she looked away. And in the dark apartment above the city that neither of them owned, something that had been building since a whispered warning beside a mahogany table took one more step toward the edge of the only name it was ever going to have. The call came at 3 in the morning and rewrote everything. Ji-hun read the message once. The stillness that followed was different from every other stillness she had seen from him. Not the controlled stillness of a man containing himself, but the stillness of someone who had absorbed an impact so precise and so targeted that the body needed a full second to understand it had been hit. His face, in the blue light of the phone screen, was something elemental. Something that had stripped away every layer that power and practice had built and found the thing underneath. Not panic, but the cold and total fury of a man whose one protected thing had just been taken. His sister, 24 years old, taken from her apartment in Yongsan at 11:47 p.m. The demand was already waiting in the message like it had been composed in advance, because it had been. He comes alone. The Incheon docks. 4 hours. Arya watched him put the phone down with exact precision, the deliberate placement of a man choosing, very carefully, not to throw it. She watched his team mobilize around him like a tide responding to a change in the moon. She stood at the edge of the room and observed the machinery of the response. Efficient, lethal, practiced. These men knew how to move. They had prepared for external aggression. What they had prepared for was an army confronting an army. She thought about warehouses, about the particular psychology of men who had set up a trap and were entirely certain of the shape of the response. "They've prepared for you to bring force," she said. The room did not stop moving. Ji-hun looked at her. "They're expecting the siege," she said. "The perimeter, the frontal pressure. They've built the space for that encounter. What they have not built the space for is something they can't categorize." He was quiet. His eyes were doing the thing she had learned to recognize, organizing, discarding, retaining. Calculating the variable she was describing without having to ask her to explain it twice. "Chairman Beck is there," he said. She had reached the same conclusion 12 seconds earlier. "He's managing the handoff personally. Which means Shin is there too. Which means there's a fault line in that room that has nothing to do with us." She told him about the port. The detail buried in the documentation from the secondary server. The Jeju concession that appeared complete in the contract but was not. The port access, the piece that made the coastal land worth anything significant, had been transferred 3 weeks before the signing to a shell company registered in Shin's personal name. Not the syndicate's, Shin's. Whether by design or desperation, Shin had kept a piece for himself. Which meant that Chairman Beck, who had invested 3 years of strategy and leverage and manufactured pressure into this acquisition, did not yet know that the prize he had been promised was already missing a piece. "I walk in," she said, "and I tell Beck what Shin did. Not as a performance. As a fact, with the documentation behind it. I let the room dissolve itself." Ji-hun looked at her for a long moment. Around them, his team had gone still, listening. "You would be inside," he said. "Alone, until we breach. I would be the most unpredictable thing in the room," she said, "which is the only thing that gives your sister time." The silence was approximately 3 seconds. She had learned that his decisions lived in the spaces between things. "You are not a soldier," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the point." He crossed the room toward her. The movement had purpose, not urgency, but intention, the particular intention of a man who has decided something and is deciding it with his body as well as his mind. He reached into the collar of the jacket he handed her and threaded an earpiece into place. Small, precise, barely visible. His fingers were careful, professional, and then his hands moved to the jacket's collar, straightening it, smoothing the fabric at her shoulders in a gesture so utilitarian it should not have carried anything else. It carried something else. He did not step back immediately. She looked up at him. His face at this distance was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, all the distance gone, the constructed remove stripped away by the weight of the next 4 hours. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something she could feel in her sternum. "I will hear everything," he said. His voice was low and precise, the words chosen with the care of a man who did not have many of this kind left in him tonight. "I will be there." She believed him. The knowledge of it settled into her chest like something solid, something she had not realized she'd been waiting for permission to feel. She nodded once. He stepped back. The room came back. The team resumed its motion. The pre-dawn dark outside the windows was absolute, the city below waiting in its ordinary, indifferent brilliance. Arya stood in the jacket that was half a size too large for her and thought about a warehouse on the Inchin docks. She thought about the particular weight of walking into a room full of dangerous men with nothing but the truth as a weapon. She thought about what she had been, 14 months ago, invisible, methodical, safe, and she thought about what she was now, and she found, to her own particular surprise, that she was not afraid. She was focused. She was clear. She was 21 years old and she had spent her whole life being underestimated in rooms that thought they already knew everything that mattered. She picked up the documentation. She walked to the door. The drive to Inchin was dark and silent, the city thinning as they moved east, the industrial edges of the port district replacing the towers and the neon with something older and colder. Arya sat in the back seat and did not make her hands into fists. She let them lie flat on her thighs, open, still. She breathed in a slow, structured rhythm. She thought about the room she was about to walk into and she organized it. The positions, the fault lines, the precise moment when information, delivered correctly, becomes more destabilizing than any weapon. She was the chaos variable. She had been one, in smaller rooms, her entire life. The warehouse materialized against the pre-dawn sky like a held breath, vast, dark, its broken windows like closed eyes waiting to open. She got out of the car. The dock air hit her face, cold and salt-sharp, smelling of rust and deep water and the particular finality of places built for things that were not meant to be witnessed. She raised her hands. She walked toward the door. They zip-tied her wrists the moment she crossed the threshold. Not roughly, efficiently, which was somehow worse. Efficiency implied she had been expected, planned for, accounted for in the architecture of a trap that had been built long before tonight. The plastic bit into the skin above her wrists and she breathed through it, cataloging the room the way she cataloged every room. Fast, thorough, without letting her eyes move in a way that telegraphed what she was doing. The warehouse was vast and cold and smelled of rust and salt water and the particular staleness of industrial spaces that had been closed around secrets for too long. High ceilings swallowed the light from the portable work lamps positioned at intervals across the concrete floor, throwing everything into hard shadow and harsh white in alternating bands. Somewhere above her, in the darkness of the rafters, she knew Ji Hun's people were already in position. She had 4 minutes before the diversion hit the south wall. She did not look at her watch. She had always kept time in her body. Director Shin stood to her left. He looked smaller here than he had in the boardroom, the estate, the executive suite, the rooms built to contain and amplify his particular authority. In the industrial dark, stripped of context, he looked like what he was. A man who had made a devastating choice and had been living inside the consequences of it long enough that relief and guilt had become indistinguishable from each other. He did not meet her eyes. Chairman Beck stood to her right. He was heavier than she had imagined, not soft, but dense, a man built like something that had been compressed by pressure over a very long time. Cold-eyed in the specific way of someone for whom violence had long ago become administrative. He wore a dark overcoat and held his stillness the way certain predators held theirs. Not absence of motion, but the patience of something that had never once needed to hurry. He studied her with the flat, evaluative attention of a man pricing an unexpected item. Between them, held by a man twice her size, was Ji Young. Choi Ji Young, the architect, the protected one, the single thing in her brother's life that had been kept deliberately separate from everything he had built and everything it cost. was 24 years old and terrified in a way that had not broken her. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, dark and liquid and fractured with intelligence, were her brother's eyes exactly. She was holding herself together through the same mechanism he used, not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let fear be the loudest thing in the room. Arya looked at her once. A single, deliberate look that said, "I see you. Stay." Then she looked at Beck. Shin spoke first. She had expected that. He identified her with the particular contempt of a man using dismissal as performance, which meant the performance was for Beck rather than for her. The foreign girl, the janitor, the interference. Each word was a small abdication of control dressed as authority, and every person in the room who was paying the right kind of attention could see the seams in it. She did not respond to Shin. She looked at Beck and she said, "He didn't tell you about the port." The quality of the silence that followed was extraordinary. Not empty structural. The silence of a room in which the load-bearing wall has just been identified. Beck's eyes narrowed by a precise degree. She continued before the silence could become a question that worked against her, clear, factual, her voice carrying through the warehouse without effort. The voice of a woman who had spent years making herself heard in rooms that were trained not to hear her. The Jeju concession in the contract, she told him, was designed to read as complete. The port access, the component that made the coastal land financially significant, the piece the syndicate needed for the shipping infrastructure the acquisition was actually about, had been transferred 3 weeks before the signing to a shell company registered in Director Shin's personal name. Not a syndicate entity, not a shared holding structure. His name, his account, his piece, carved quietly from the prize before the prize was delivered. "The registration documents exist," she said. "Check the filing date." She watched it move through Beck's face, not across it, through it, beneath the surface, the way seismic events move through stone before the stone knows it's moving. His gaze traveled to Shin with a slowness that was more terrifying than speed. Shin's composure, which had been extraordinary until this moment, developed a single visible fracture. The slight opening of his mouth, the breath drawn to construct a denial. The breath held instead when he understood that denial had just become the most dangerous thing available to him. The south wall detonated. The warehouse shook, a deep, structural shudder that moved through the concrete floor and up through the soles of her feet. The work lamps swung. Men moved. The organized choreography of Beck's people fractured into the particular chaos of professionals responding to an unplanned variable, which was faster and more disciplined than amateurs but still, crucially, responsive rather than initiating. She was already moving. The table she had noted on entry was 6 feet to her left, a folding surface holding equipment and papers, and, at its edge, the heavy crystal ashtray she had logged without appearing to look at it. She reached it in 4 steps and drove her knee into the table's leg with everything she had. The surface upended. Equipment scattered across concrete with a crash that added to the chaos in exactly the way she needed. She dropped to her knees, bound hands finding the largest shard of shattered crystal on the floor, cold and sharp and precise against her palm. She dragged it across the zip tie. One hard pull. The plastic gave. Her hands were free. The man holding Ji Young had turned toward the sound of gunfire opening in the rafters. Ji Hun's team, positioned and patient, doing the work they had been built to do. His grip on Ji Young's arm had loosened by the specific margin that made the difference between possible and impossible. Arya grabbed the iron pipe leaning against the pillar at her back. She had seen it the moment she entered, had placed it in her internal map of the room like a coordinate and swung it in a single arc at the back of the man's knee. The joint buckled. The grip released. Ji Young twisted free with the fast, furious efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this much space and did not intend to waste it. The firefight was brief and surgical. Ji Hun's people knew the architecture of the room and had the high ground and had been waiting. When silence returned to the warehouse, it came all at once, the specific silence of completed violence, heavy and absolute and smelling of concrete dust and gunpowder. Arya stood with the pipe still in her hand. Her knuckles were bleeding where the crystal shard had caught them. Her dress, the borrowed one, dark and structured, had a tear at the hem from the drop to the floor. Her coils had come half loose from their pins, falling around her face in a way that was not composed and did not need to be. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps on the concrete, purposeful, fast, moving through the aftermath directly toward her. She turned. Ji Hun crossed the warehouse floor and stopped in front of her, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. Not soft, he did not know how to be soft, had perhaps never learned, but open, genuinely and completely open, in the way of a man whose control has been temporarily overridden by something stronger than the habit of it. He took in the shattered ashtray, the broken zip tie, the iron pipe, the blood on her knuckles. His jaw was working. His eyes were doing something she felt in the base of her throat. He reached out and took the pipe from her hand. Set it aside with a care that was almost gentle, the way you set aside something that has done its work and deserves acknowledgement for it. His fingers stayed around her wrist for a moment after the pipe left her grip, not holding, not restraining, just present. She could feel her own pulse beneath his hand. I told you, he said, his voice stripped down to something that lived well beneath his usual register, to be a distraction. She needed someone to be more than that, Arya said. He had nothing to say to that. He did not try. His thumb moved once across the inside of her wrist, a single, barely perceptible motion, almost involuntary, the kind of touch that happens before the mind has given permission, and then his hand released her and he stepped back, and the distance between them was once again the negotiated space of two people who had not yet found the language for what was accumulating between them. Across the warehouse, Director Shin sat on the concrete floor surrounded by Ji-hun's men, looking up at Ji-hun with an expression that contained, in precise equal measure, guilt and exhaustion, and something that might have been, beneath everything else, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying an impossible weight for 3 years and has finally, catastrophically, set it down. I had no choice, Shin said. His voice was the voice of a man who had rehearsed this sentence 10,000 times and still found it insufficient. Ji-hun crouched in front of him. The movement was unhurried. His face, when he spoke, was almost quiet. I know, he said. That is the only reason you are still alive. The mercy in it was real, and it was devastating, not forgiveness, not absolution, but the specific compassion of a man who understood the shape of an impossible choice and punished it accordingly. With consequence that had to be lived through rather than ended. Arya watched it happen and understood something about the man crouching on the warehouse floor that she had not fully understood before. He was not just powerful. He was precise. And precision, in a man like this, was its own form of terrifying grace. The days after the warehouse were quiet in the way of things that have earned their quiet. Not empty, earned. There is a difference, and Arya had learned to feel it. The city outside the penthouse windows continued its indifferent brilliance, 42 floors below, as if the Han River had not witnessed the particular week that had just occurred. Seoul did not mourn or celebrate what happened in its margins. It simply continued, which was its own kind of wisdom. Director Shin was dealt with in the language of the world he had chosen. Stripped of his position, his access, his financial stake, his proximity to everything he had spent 30 years building inside the Choi Empire. He was permitted to live in a form of monitored distance that was its own sentence, the kind that required waking up every morning and inhabiting the consequences of what he had done. Arya sat with the complexity of that outcome without endorsing or condemning it. She had made her choice to enter this world with her eyes open. Part of living in it honestly was seeing its justice for what it was, not clean, not simple, but not arbitrary either. Choi Ji-young came to the penthouse on the third day. She entered the room with the controlled energy of a woman who had been frightened and had decided, on the far side of that fear, to be done with performing smallness. She was striking her brother's jaw, her brother's eyes, but warmer, faster to show what moved through them. She looked at Arya with a directness that required no preamble. You hit a man with a pipe for me, she said. I don't know you. I think I owe you something. Arya told her she didn't. Ji-young studied her for a long moment, the assessing look of a woman who had grown up inside a world that required accurate readings of people, and had become very good at it. Then something moved through her face that might have been a decision. My brother looked at you in the car on the way back, she said. The way our father used to look at our mother. She let the sentence land without decoration. Then she turned and left the room, and Arya sat alone with the weight of what had just been placed in front of her, which was not nothing, and was not simple, and which she did not pretend to herself that she had not already felt the outline of. The life she had planned, quiet, ordered, accumulated credential by credential, tuition payment by tuition payment, was no longer the life available to her. The door to it had closed the moment she leaned toward a dangerous man and whispered 4 words, and she had understood, somewhere in the middle of everything that followed, that grieving it was necessary, and that grieving it did not mean she had made the wrong choice. Both things were true simultaneously. She let them be. She submitted her final paper on social stratification from the kitchen of a penthouse 42 floors above the Han River. She had spent 14 months cleaning the building below her. The particular dark humor of that was not lost on her, and she allowed herself one private, genuine moment of acknowledging it. The evening came, and with it Gi Hun. He found her on the balcony, the one she had been permitted to access but never permitted to leave, which had always been a distinction she felt precisely. He stood beside her without preamble, without the structured entry of a man approaching a conversation he had prepared. He simply arrived. The city was laid out beneath them in its cold, enormous entirety, light layered on light, the Han River a dark seam running through it, the towers of Gangnam burning against a sky that had gone the deep blue of something between night and the memory of day. He talked about the future. The empire's restructuring. The gaps in the board that needed to be filled not by loyalty purchased with money or coerced with leverage, but by something rarer, the kind of loyalty that had been tested by impossible circumstances and had held. He talked with the careful specificity of a man who was saying one thing on the surface and something entirely different underneath it, and who understood that she was following both conversations simultaneously. When he stopped, the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that does not ask to be filled. "I need someone I trust completely," he said. Not to her, exactly, to the city, to the air, to the particular darkness between the lights. "I have not had that since my father." A pause long enough to be intentional. "I have it now." She looked at the lights. She made him wait for her answer, not strategically, not as a performance of power, but because some things deserved to be spoken only after being fully felt. She had spent a long time in this city making herself invisible, making herself small, making herself the shape the room required. She was done performing smallness. "I'm not a replacement for what you lost," she said. Her voice was steady and low and entirely her own. "I'm something else. I don't have a name for it yet." He turned to look at her. The city light caught the line of his jaw, the ink at his neck, the precise architecture of a face that had spent 32 years learning not to show what moved through it, and was showing it now. Not performing openness. Actually open. "Neither do I," he said. "I find I am comfortable with that." She looked at him. The distance between them on the balcony was small, the negotiated distance of two people who had been moving toward each other through 8 chapters of danger and disclosure and reckless, irreversible choice. His eyes on hers were steady and dark and carrying something that had no name yet and was deciding, in this particular moment, that it did not need one. She reached out and straightened the collar of his shirt, a small, deliberate gesture, unhurried, the kind that says, "I am here. I am choosing to be here." Her fingers brushed the ink at his neck and he went very still, the stillness of a man choosing not to move so that the moment does not end before it is finished. Then his hand came up and covered hers. Gently, completely. The city burned beneath them. The Han River moved in the dark. Some endings are not endings at all. Some of them are the first honest breath a person has taken in a very long time. Arya Hunter, diplomat's daughter, Yonsei scholar, former ghost of the 42nd floor, stood at the edge of an empire she had walked into with nothing but 4 words and the stubborn, inconvenient architecture of her own integrity, and she did not flinch from what she saw. She saw clearly. She always had. She was simply, finally, allowing herself to be seen in return. 3 weeks after the warehouse, someone left a mop leaning against the service entrance of the 42nd floor. No note. No explanation. The staff denied knowledge of it with the particular blankness of people who had been briefed to deny knowledge of it. Arya stood in the doorway of the executive suite, the suite with the Italian marble and the chandelier that threw fractured light like cold diamonds, the suite where the Han River filled the southern wall and the air still carried, if she was honest, the ghost of cedarwood and whiskey and decisions. And looked at the mop for a long moment. Then she picked it up. She held it for exactly as long as she needed to. Long enough to feel the weight of it, not metaphorically, but actually, the solid familiar weight of the tool she had moved across this floor in slow arcs for 14 months, invisible and meticulous and entirely underestimated. Long enough to remember the woman who had held it the night everything began. Long enough to understand what had survived that woman and what had been shed. She set it against the wall. She walked to the window. The city was lit beneath her like a second sky, vast and indifferent and brilliant, 10 million lives running their parallel courses 42 floors below, none of them aware of what had shifted in the upper atmosphere of the empire that sat above them. The board had been restructured. The White Tiger Syndicate had retreated, its chairman facing internal consequences that had nothing to do with Arya and everything to do with the discovery of Shin's private port transfer, a detail that had fractured a criminal alliance from the inside out, the way the right truth always fractured the wrong structure when it was placed with precision. Arya had placed it with precision. She was not the same woman who had leaned over a mahogany table and whispered 4 words into the dark. She was not entirely certain who she was yet, which was, she had decided, the correct and honest answer. She was a diplomat's daughter who had chosen invisibility and then chosen, once, with her whole body and her whole stubborn self, to be visible. She was a graduate student who had submitted a paper on social stratification from the penthouse of a criminal empire and received a distinction. She was a woman who had hit a man with a pipe and freed a stranger and walked into a warehouse full of dangerous men armed with nothing but documented truth and the nerve to deliver it. She was the woman Choi Ji-hun looked at the way his father had looked at his mother. She was still deciding what to do with that, not with the feeling, which she had stopped pretending she did not have, but with the sheer enormity of the life it implied. The empire was real. Its costs were real. The man at its center was not safe and had never claimed to be, and she had not chosen him because she believed he was. She had chosen him, was choosing him, in the continuous present tense of an ongoing decision, because he was honest in the way that mattered most. He did not pretend the world was something other than what it was, and he did not pretend she was something less than what she was, and in her experience those two things together were rarer than power and more valuable than safety. The door behind her opened. She did not turn. She knew his footsteps now, the particular cadence of them, the way they slowed when he entered a room she was already in, as if he was adjusting his pace to the fact of her presence. He stopped beside her at the window. Close. The warmth of him at her shoulder was familiar now in a way she had stopped pretending to be surprised by. "The board meeting is at 9, he said. "I know. You don't have to attend." She turned to look at him. His profile against the city light was the profile she had memorized without intending to. Jaw sharp, ink at the neck. The specific weight of a man who carried an empire the way other people carried grief, in the body, distributed, always present. His eyes, when they found hers, were the eyes she had first seen across a mahogany table at midnight, carrying that fractured intelligence that moved too fast for the stillness of his face to fully contain. "I know," she said again. Differently. Something moved across his face, not a smile, not entirely, but the movement toward one, the specific shift of a man allowing himself the beginning of an expression he had not permitted himself in a very long time. It transformed him in a way that was almost difficult to look at directly, the way certain kinds of light were almost too precise. He reached out and tucked a single coil of her hair back from her face, a gesture so quiet and so deliberate that it occupied the room completely, the way very small sounds occupied very large silences. His fingers grazed her cheekbone. He did not pull his hand back immediately. Neither of them spoke. The city breathed beneath them. The Han River moved. The empire sat in its 42 floors of marble and power and necessary darkness, and at its highest point, in the room that smelled of cedarwood and decisions, 2 people stood at the edge of something that had no name yet and was not asking for one. She turned back to the window. His hand lowered slowly. His shoulder stayed against hers, warm, solid, present. The sun was beginning to find the eastern towers, burning the first thin line of gold into the edge of the sky. Seoul was waking. The city that had never once looked up at her was looking up at nothing, the way cities always did, indifferent and eternal and entirely unaware that above it, the ghost of the 42nd floor had put down her mop and taken her place at the window. She was not invisible. She was not a precaution. She was not a variable, not a witness, not a foreign girl in a gray uniform who had wandered into a world too large for her. She was exactly where she had chosen to be, with the full knowledge of what that cost, the full weight of what it meant, and the absolute, clear-eyed, unperforming certainty of a woman who had looked at an empire built on darkness and decided that the truest, most dangerous thing she had ever done was not the night she warned a stranger. It was the morning she stopped being a stranger to herself.